Fascism and the forces of reaction have always been very good at using religion to its own ends. While neither Mussolini nor Hitler were particularly personally devout, both were happy to ally themselves with reactionary elements within Christianity, and this would serve their movement well. The Catholic Church, for example, was instrumental in the post-war rat lines helping Nazis escape Europe, and also in rehabilitating the European right in the late 40s and 50s. In our own day, fascism has been no less successful in using religion as a way to justify reactionary politics. In the US, the Christian right are more emboldened now than they have ever been, and from this base are growing a global reactionary movement. In opposition to Cuba's family laws, to the rise of the Bolsonaro movement in Brazil, to the recent anti-gay laws in Uganda and elsewhere, the hand and purse of right-wing evangelicals can be found. But it isn't just evangelicalism which is stoking the flames of reaction. In countries like Poland and Italy and in Spain, a defence of Christian values rooted in Catholicism is often at the heart of attacks on LGBTQ people and other minorities. While in the US, the majority of Supreme Court justices who are currently gutting civil rights are practising Catholics. Anglicanism too is playing its part. Organisations such as the Global Anglican Futures Conference and the Conservative Anglican Realignment Movement have been at the forefront of resisting the expansion of gay and women's rights across the global south. Christian denominations that, not so long ago, would have been sworn enemies of each other are now united in their efforts to roll back the clock. If you follow the religious right at all, you will no doubt be aware that figures from every corner of reactionary Christianity have started appearing in each other's podcasts, sharing each other's articles, and showing up in each other's Twitter spaces. It seems that, to 21st century conservative Christianity, more important than any confessional identity is a commitment to a transnational reactionary agenda. What is often missing in this discussion is the situation in the United Kingdom. In some ways, this is understandable. Unlike a lot of the aforementioned countries, Britain is not particularly religiously observant. Only about 5% of the UK population attends church weekly, compared to about 20% of the population in the United States, or 37% in Italy. And while most of our prime ministers have been fairly devout practising Christians, they do not really talk about the faith or the church in the carrying out of their public duties. When, for example, Tony Blair toyed in the early 2000s with the idea of inserting a God Bless Britain at the end of a speech, he was famously told by his communication director, "We do not do God." But this hasn't stopped the development of a homegrown right-wing Christian movement. And right at the forefront of that growing movement is our main character for today, the Reverend Calvin Robinson. In 2022, Calvin shot from relative obscurity to become, arguably, the most influential voice on the British Christian nationalist scene. He has a weekly talk show called Calvin's Common Sense Crusade that is broadcast nationally, and an irregular column in two of the best-selling newspapers in the country. He's also become a regular on the right-wing podcast circuit, both in the UK and in the US. Now, some of you might disagree with me for classing Calvin as a Christian nationalist, and we will get to that in a little bit. But for now, let's just say that his persona, when he is speaking to a more secular audience, is often quite different from when he thinks he is speaking to an explicitly Christian one. But if you do engage with enough of his work, you can't possibly miss his ideological project, which is one of fighting back against secular liberalism and replacing it with what he would perceive to be values rooted in the Bible. And I think that is pretty much textbook Christian nationalism. So let's delve into Calvin Robinson and fascism with Anglican characteristics. Before he shot to fame, Calvin Robinson was an activist in the Conservative Party and something of an also-ran in local elections, until 2020, when he decided to follow his calling to become an Anglican priest, and started studying at the Oxford Seminary St Stephen's Hall. He also started a budding media career, writing irregular opinion pieces in various right-wing outlets. He really came to national prominence, however, on the 21st of May 2022, when the Mail on Sunday, a notorious right-wing rag, reported in an article called "Not Woke Enough to Be a Vicar" that Robinson had been barred from taking up his calling in a parish in London because the woke Bishop of London, Sarah Mullally, didn't agree with his political views. The article was accompanied with a first-person account of the ordeal by Calvin himself, in which he recounts being told by the white bishop her disbelief that he, as a black man, would doubt the institutional racism of the church. He also makes clear he feels the Church of England had been captured by liberal progressives, and that his commitment to traditional values were the principal reason for his cancellation. The story was then taken up by the Daily Telegraph the next day, with an article called "Black Conservative Trainee Vicar Blocked from Joining C.V. over Anti-Woke Views." From there, it would enter the right-wing media sphere. GB News, the UK's answer to Fox, would also publish a think piece from him on their website, and in the coming weeks would have him on their TV shows several times to talk about his experiences. I'm going to show you a clip from Calvin discussing his cancellation on GB News. It's a rather long clip, but I think it is important to understand what is happening with Calvin. He has just been asked how he is dealing with his cancellation, and this is how he replies.
On the one hand, it's been heartbreaking and soul destroying because I haven't applied for a job. I haven't gone for a position. I've been discerning and praying through a long process of months and years to a calling, something that I feel called to by God, and so that the church acknowledged that calling. So to be denied it at the last minute after I've just finished my training is hard. But at the same time, it's like a weight off my shoulders. I feel liberated from the stifling establishment, and I can now get on with my ministry without having to battle the wokeness within the church every day on issues of gender, race, sexuality, and get back to scripture, get back to the Bible, and get back to teaching what we're supposed to be teaching rather than climate change or Brexit.
So the narrative that Calvin is creating here on GB News and in his articles in the Mail and the Telegraph goes something like this then. The Church of England has been captured by the woke, liberal, left elites, and is no longer a broad church in which dissenting voices can be heard. He is evidence of this because the woke bishops turned on him, and he was cancelled for merely daring to question the woke orthodoxy that has replaced the Bible in the established church. All Calvin wanted to do, you see, is to stop talking about politics and return to the Christian values, and he has been martyred for it. But this narrative has several problems. First, it should be stated that the Bishop of London has refuted Calvin's story. She says that his politics played absolutely no part in her decision, and it is merely an issue with limited placement spaces for applicants. Now, in other interviews, it has to be said, Calvin has said that the Bishop of London is just covering her ass. I have absolutely no way of determining who is actually correct here. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Calvin's version of the story is closer to the truth. After all, it wouldn't be the first time that the church has covered something up to prevent embarrassment. So let's say that he was barred from the priesthood due to his political beliefs, or at least to the way he expressed them. I think my question to Calvin would be, what exactly is wrong with that? You see, Christianity, just like many other religions, has always been political. When Jesus was criticising the religious authorities in Jerusalem, these were people who had real political and economic power, and he was executed by the Roman Empire, at least in part, due to his opposition to that empire. And more particularly in England itself, the bishops in England have always been pretty political people. Most famously, perhaps, is the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, who was killed in 1170 in Canterbury Cathedral itself due to his opposition to the king of the time. And Thomas wasn't even the only archbishop to be killed for political reasons. And in our own time, Church of England bishops have seats in the House of Lords, our second legislative chamber, meaning the British constitutional setup doesn't just encourage bishops to have opinions in politics, but actively seeks out their participation in the law-making process. So, Calvin's criticism of the Church of England bishops wading into political issues is out of keeping with the history of the Church in the United Kingdom. They cannot, as Calvin suggests, return to an apolitical reading of the Bible because there is no apolitical period for the Church of England to return to. Rightly or wrongly, the Church of England has always been a political church. And if churches have political lines, it seems pretty uncontroversial to me that a church can then discipline priests or even members for breaking those lines in certain ways. After all, churches have, quite literally for thousands of years, been policing who can and cannot be members, sometimes quite violently. I mean, that's what the word orthodoxy or right belief means, right? Those with orthodox beliefs are in the church, and those who do not have orthodox beliefs are outside it. And if you do not subscribe to the orthodoxy of a particular church, well, yeah, you cannot be a priest. Now, while most of these orthodox beliefs, the virgin birth, the afterlife, transubstantiation, aren't really going to touch on the political sphere, some probably are. I mean, a good example of this might be the issue of abortion in the Catholic Church. There's an issue that is rooted in Catholic theology, which can and does impact policy, and the Church can and does police membership based on this very political issue. For example, most recently in the United States, certain Catholic bishops have been denying communion to politicians deemed to be too pro-abortion. And in the Church of England, I know, it is very difficult for committed Republicans to be open and honest about their beliefs, because the Church is still headed by hereditary monarch King Charles. So I just don't think it's credible to say the Church should not, under any circumstances, consider your political views when you're applying for the priesthood. Churches obviously can, and do, assess members on political grounds all the time. And Calvin clearly agrees that clerics can and should be political. Calvin now hosts a weekly show that explicitly tries to bring a religious perspective to politics. But even before his quote-unquote cancellation, he was writing opinion pieces in the right-wing press. And these articles aren't banal, centrist, thought-of-the-day kind of pieces either. They are often very, very political, arguing for or against government policy. Not unlike what he is criticising the bishops for doing. But then I suppose he might argue, as he does in his profile on GB News website, that he isn't arguing that the Church of England should never do politics. He just wants diversity of opinion respected. He is just a free thinker opposing the groupthink of the establishment. But the problem is, Calvin wasn't just carrying out his priestly duties and then was attacked by the big bad woke bishop. No, he was very publicly attacking the hierarchy of the institution he wanted to join. Like, for example, here he is in a more recent debate on gay marriage at the Oxford Union, talking about the hierarchy of the church.
We have church leaders attempting to drag the church into apostasy.
Apostasy, if you don't know, is the abandonment of correct or moral belief. So here we have Calvin accusing the leadership of the Church of England of purposefully leading the church away from Christ. Now, obviously, it's a bit weird under any circumstances to go this hard against the management of the place you're applying to work, and then be a little bit confused when you don't get the job. But I think in the case of the priesthood of the Church of England, it goes a little bit beyond insulting the boss. You see, Calvin is applying to join an Episcopal church. What this means is it is led by bishops and archbishops. These are men and women, in the case of Church of England, who are meant to lead the church in the place of Christ. As a priest, you are meant to, within reason, follow the guidance of your bishop. They are your guide, your manager, in how you should carry out your priestly duties. You certainly aren't meant to very publicly declare that they are leading the church away from God. And if you aren't happy about being under the authority of a bishop, it's a little confusing as to why you would join a church with an episcopal structure in the first place. But I think the real icing on the cake in this argument is that the reason the Bishop of London may have taken Calvin's political views into account are because Calvin asked her to. Here he is discussing how he sees his vocation on Pints with Aquinas, a far-right Catholic talk show.
I have a bivocational calling, and this is a word that I've been given by the Bishop of Fulham, that I feel strongly called to parish ministry, but also to public ministry. And the work that I'm doing on TV, in the newspapers, I didn't have my own show by this point, but I was being a commentator on other people's shows. The work that I'm doing there is proclaiming the gospel, proclaiming the truth. And I think it's important to ears that wouldn't necessarily hear it otherwise.
This bivocational calling is something he mentions in his initial article in the Mail on Sunday as well. What it means is that he sees his political work for newspapers and on TV as part of his role as a priest. It is therefore not particularly surprising that the person whose job it is to decide if he should be a priest or not would then read his political work and take it into account when deciding on his vocation. They aren't digging around in his articles and on his tweets. They are assessing his vocation based on the criteria Calvin gave them. But okay, so this right-wing figure is making a big deal out of a cancellation and there isn't all that much to it. Fine, it's not the first time a right-wing figure has done that. So why should we care? Well, because the question we should be asking is why the right-wing media gave him so much oxygen in the first place. Like, let's be clear, Calvin Robinson wasn't that important. He was, at the time he appeared on the national scene, a student with a couple of opinion pieces under his belt. Yet within a year of this story breaking, he had become a media personality with not an inconsiderable following. Like, at the time of writing this, he has about 250,000 followers on Twitter. So why did the right-wing media sphere elevate him to such a height? Well, I think actually the forces behind the heightened interest of the right-wing media in Calvin Robinson's story is actually included in the initial segment from GB News that helped break the story in the first place. I've already shown you a clip from this segment. But at the end of the segment, Mark Dolan, the host, introduces 3 talking heads to weigh in what they think about Calvin's story. And the first one, Rebecca Jane, says this.
And obviously, like Calvin says, this is a calling. And to then be denied it by somebody is just not appropriate. Who are they to decide?
Well, Rebecca, they are quite literally the decision people. Like in the Church of England, it is quite literally part of the bishop's job to decide if you should or should not be a priest. Like, what is Rebecca even proposing here? That everyone who shows up to a parish and says, "Oh, God is calling me to run this church," is just kind of be given the position of priest? But then her next statement kind of gives the game away.
As somebody that was raised going to Sunday school, and it was absolutely lost on me, sorry mum and dad, until the age of 13, I can tell you that actually what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve appeals to me far more than the Christian faith.
Calvin appears to her far more than the Christian faith, something she seems to have stopped practising at around the age of 13. Rebecca, by her own admission, has no real interest in the church, or a clear knowledge of how the episcopal structure is made to work. What she is interested in, though, is the politics that Calvin represents. This interest the show has in Calvin's politics, as opposed to his theology, is further reinforced by the second guest, Liliane Dowding, who says...
And what you were saying about white-splaining, it really is a thing. I just got into a huge spat with somebody on Twitter because they told me that I should be offended. A white liberal, obviously, wokey, lefty, told me I should be offended when somebody asks where I'm from or where my parents are from.
Like, what does this Twitter spat have to do with the direction of the Church of England? Like, absolutely nothing at all. But for Liliane, the interesting thing about Calvin's story is that, for her, it reveals what she already suspected, that it's the liberals who are the real racists. And this is quite a common line of argument among conservatives in the English-speaking world, that it is the liberals who are the real racists. Now, far be it from me to discount this. I do think a lot of liberal institutions are institutionally racist. But there does seem to be a little bit of a tension in this argument for me, being made in this clip. Like, the argument seems to be that liberals are racist, that liberals have taken over the Church of England, but it is silly to suggest that the Church of England is racist. Like, it feels to me that premises A and B, that liberals are racist and that they have taken over the church, is kind of in tension with premise C, that it is absurd to say that that church is racist. But then we get to the final talking head, Mike Parry, who says...
I think if you do get through this, over this first massive hurdle, if you do manage to become ordained, that might be when your problems really start, because you're going to be a lone voice inside the Church of England. The Church of England is now a political lobby, and the politics that they expound are all left-wing political ideas.
Mike here is just mirroring what Calvin has said earlier in the segment, and we've already went over why saying the church has become too political is a little bit strange to me. But at least I suppose Mike is back talking about the church. Again, we have this reiteration of the problem for conservatives, that the church has become too political. But then, after Mike spends a little bit of time complaining about how the Church of England bishops' opposition to the government's refugee and welfare policy is bad, he then says this.
Don't they realise that one of the Christian callings is the dignity of the individual, not somebody having to live off the welfare state, but wanting to stand on their own 2 feet, make their own way in life, and become a good person who has the right to support their own family and those around them who they love. They mix up goodness. Look, I'm really good because I'm sympathetic and kind. I want to help people, and the government can spend an awful lot more money doing that on my behalf. They confuse that with the reality of life, where most people, and take the Red Wall in the north of England, do actually want to become more independent and live their own lives, and that's according to Christian beliefs.
So again, there seems to be a tension here. Mike thinks the church is too political, but also that the church should be supporting conservative economic policies because this is in line with Christianity. So which one is it, Mike? Is it too political? Or is it not political enough? And what does Calvin, the man who earlier in this segment was complaining about the church becoming involved in politics, say in response to this? Well, he thinks
conservative values are in line with Christian values, but at the moment, we're far more likely to hear a bishop preaching on climate change or preaching about how bad Brexit is or the latest conservative government policy and how horrible and ungodly that is than we are to hear the bishops preaching about the faith.
So this is why I really love this clip from GB News, because it kind of reveals what is happening underneath the surface here. The problem in Calvin's story was never that the church doesn't have enough conservative voices, or that it should return to an apolitical reading of the Bible, or they're getting too much involved in the world of politics. No, instead the problem with the Church of England for conservatives like Calvin and Mike and the rest of the people at GB News is that it isn't supporting the right kind of politics. So perhaps it is worth pausing to talk about why conservatives are so obsessed with the Church of England's politics in the first place. So, in the United Kingdom, the Church of England is the established church. What this means is that it is the official church of the land. The head of state, King Charles, is also the head of the church, and at major state occasions like coronations, state funerals, royal weddings, national days of remembrance, and the like, the clergy from the Church of England get to play an active part. They're also involved in the shaping of legislation. In many of the historic buildings associated with Christianity in this country, like Westminster Cathedral, St Paul's, or York Minster, are in their care. What this means that even as weekly attendance continues to fall, the Church of England continues to have a lot of institutional, cultural and economic power. And this is why conservatives like Rebecca and Liliane, who evidently have little interest in the faith or the broader movement of the church, have such an interest in Calvin's story. You see, as UK politics continues to lurch further and further to the right, the Church of England has become one of the last bastions of opposition to this right-wing movement. I think Calvin is being promoted by the right-wing media as an effective tool in the attack on this institution which is resisting their reactionary turn. The aim, it seems, is to replace the milquetoast liberalism of the current Archbishop of Canterbury and his House of Bishops with a much more reactionary politics of Calvin, or, failing that, perhaps just cow the church into silence like they have done previously with institutions like the BBC or the National Trust. I think this is at the heart of why Calvin is being promoted so heavily by the right-wing media just now. Not because they particularly care about the apostasy of the Church of England, but because it helps further their ideological project and further turn British institutions toward reaction. So since Calvin is being used as part of a move to push British institutions further to the right, perhaps it is worth stopping to think about what is their ideological project for the Church of England country as a whole. So I think Calvin's ideology falls into two distinct parts. On the one hand, we have an opposition to wokeness, a kind of strong anti-woke feeling, and on the other, we have a pro-biblical world view. So let's start with his opposition to wokeness, because it's probably the one you will hear most often on his show. Calvin Robinson recently was invited on the popular right-wing chat show host Pints with Aquinas, and was asked by the show's host, Matt Fraud, how he defines wokeness. Calvin responded,
It's kind of an anti-religion, really. I think it's the antithesis of Christianity. I think that Western society was built on a foundation of Christ, faith and family, and woke is the latest in a long line of Marxist, communist ideas of destroying that Western society. And to destroy that, you have to break down the fundamentals, which are the faith and the family. And woke is a way of doing that.
There you have it. Wokeness is just Marxism. The problem is, Calvin has called, among other things, corporations, the British Broadcasting Corporation, and the Church of England woke. And if you think the current Archbishop of Canterbury, an old Etonian, an Oxford University graduate, a former oil executive, and the crowner of hereditary kings is actually a secret Marxist, then I think maybe you have to go back to reading some theory. But then on the right, calling someone a communist has never really signified actual belief in communism, I suppose. During the Cold War, for instance, communism really just meant a person who was opposed to you. And here Calvin tells us woke means pretty much the same thing. It is basically those opposed to his biblical worldview, which, in his terms, is the bedrock of Western civilization. So, if you happen to be called woke by right-wingers like Calvin, really all it means is that you want to change society in some way that they dislike. But listen to what Calvin is saying here. The woke isn't just disagreeing with him. They are attacking everything he holds dear, the very bedrock of Western civilization itself. The liberals he thinks are taking over British institutions aren't just political opponents, they are an existential threat. And part of this threat is because, in Calvin's cosmology, wokeism has all the power. For example, here he is again, speaking at the Oxford University debate on gay marriage.
I genuinely struggled with this one. I've struggled sleeping this week, actually. I don't get stage fright. I never get nervous when I go on television. I recently debated at the Cambridge Union and the Durham Union, no problem whatsoever. But there's something different about this one. It's been causing me anxiety. So someone kindly sent me Luke chapter 12, verses 11 to 12, saying, "And when they bring you before the synagogues and the rulers and the authorities, do not be anxious about how you should defend yourself and what you should say, for the Holy Spirit will teach you in that very hour what you ought to say."
Do you hear that? He is anxious. He has trouble sleeping. Why? Well, because he is up against the rulers, the authorities, the powers that be. This is a theme he will come back to again and again, on his show, in his interviews, in his speeches, and on his Twitter account. He has said, for example, that gay people have gone from being an oppressed class to the oppressors, that trans people are a threat to children, that the woke elites that control our corporations are a threat to civilization. And I think these two strands of his anti-woke narrative are very important. That wokeism, broadly defined, is both an existential threat to civilization and it happens to be winning. Never mind that he has been invited to speak at the Oxford Union, or that he has his own TV show, or that he has friends in Parliament. No, his idea of traditionalism has become an embattled minority. And why is it so important to believe this? Well, because this becomes a powerful recruitment tool for Calvin and his movement. They are the underdog, and nothing sells quite like an underdog story. But then perhaps it is worth thinking about what Calvin is trying to recruit you to. Well, he is trying to recruit you to Christian nationalism. Remember, he defined wokeism as opposed to Western civilization, which he defines as
built on a foundation of Christ, faith and family.
And even on his earliest appearance in GB News, he made clear that he thought
conservative values are in line with Christian values.
So Western civilization itself, and his politics, is based on the idea of Christ, faith and family, on conservative social values. In short, it is Christian nationalism, a politics based on religion. And he does want religion to influence the public sphere. For example, later on in the interview with Matt Fraud on Pints with Aquinas, they come to talk about the British politician and former cabinet member Jacob Rees-Mogg, and Calvin lays out his main disagreement with him.
The one criticism I've always had of him, and I've said this to his face so it's not two-faced, is that he needs to let his faith affect his politics. He tries to compartmentalise and say, I'm a Catholic, but that won't affect how I'll vote. No, being a Catholic should affect how you vote.
Yeah.
So there you have it. Politicians should be led by biblical values, by their faith, by the church. Calvin also believes in Christian instruction in public schools and opposes the disestablishment of the Church of England. His opposition to a whole host of things, like for instance the expansion of queer rights, is also mostly rooted in his belief that it is not supported in the Bible. And this should concern us, because his politics would be pretty awful if enacted. For example, on his Substack, he makes clear his belief that trans people, for example, do not exist, that abortion is legalised infanticide, and that Enoch Powell a famous racist from the 1950s was right, and that diversity has weakened the English race. What is perhaps more worrying is Calvin has been very successful at broadening his appeal beyond the tiny segment of the British population who would let biblical values guide their voting patterns. And he does this by making a broader appeal for those values, by not just rooting them within the biblical text, but, as he does on Pints with Aquinas, by reminding us that they are values of our forefathers, and they work just great for them. Calvin will constantly be talking about how we need to return to a better time before these divisive left-wing woke bishops and other politicians started to divide us. Worried about trans people? A modern fad. Think the Church of England is too left-wing? Well, it's just a woke modern takeover. Don't like Black Lives Matter? Well, they're an American cultural import, not needed in the United Kingdom. And what rooting these biblical values in the British past does is it allows the non-religious conservatives, like those we've already encountered on GP News, to buy into Calvin's story. You can accept his values, not necessarily because you believe in God or are particularly religious, but because our society used to believe in his values, and everything seemed to work back then. But the problem is, these traditional values rooted in the past are largely based on a misreading of what the UK was like when we lived closer to these values. Remember, Calvin came to prominence on the idea that liberals in the Church of England and elsewhere are inadvertently introducing Americanised idea of racism to the United Kingdom, which has, up until this point, been largely accepting of minorities. For example, here he is again on Pints with Aquinas talking about Black Lives Matter.
There is a black culture in America, whether it's hip hop culture or whatever. There's, because of the way that America has come to be, there was segregation, and so there has been a community that's developed. We didn't have that in the UK. So my parents, my father's parents, came over from Jamaica in Windrush, 1950s, and integrated into the UK society. And at that time, most people who came over did integrate and just became British.
Now, as I grew up in the UK as a white person, I can kind of appreciate why Calvin is saying this. You see, in the UK, you're often taught that American racism was somehow more pernicious than that we had in the UK. That while we in the UK had our problems, well, it was nothing like what it was like over there. In Old Blighty, you see, we always valued fair play and appreciated hard work, no matter your background, even if the occasional racist ruined it for everyone else. And this certainly seems to be, more or less, Calvin's take. The issue is, this is not a true depiction of the 1950s UK. And you don't even really need to read works like Akala's Natives or David Olagusa's Black and British or Satham Sagira's Empire Land to understand that the British Empire and Britain was just as racist as anyone in Dixie. I mean, a quick check on Wikipedia will tell you about the Bristol bus boycotts, where contemporaries of the American Civil Rights Movement were campaigning against a very real segregation in English cities. So a big problem with Calvin's story and his greater political project is it is harking back to a time that didn't really exist. Whether that time be one where the Church of England was apolitical, or a time where the United Kingdom was race-blind. And I mean, this probably shouldn't really surprise us. He is, after all, an Anglo-Catholic, something I think he would posit as a return to tradition, but which is largely an invention by camp Victorian clerics obsessed by Romantic and Gothic literature. But I think this is always what reactionary politics does, right? It is a reminder of past glories, but also a constant reassurance to you that the things you like about modernity, whether that be the fact that black people can show up on TV or women can go to work without being sexually harassed, can remain with us when we return to that golden tradition. And I think in the UK, reminders of our past glories are particularly appealing, especially now that we are less relevant and weaker than any time in the last 400 years. Calvin's role in the right-wing media sphere is not actually to bring religion, I think. It is instead to remind us, as British citizens, of these past glories, and to tell us again and again that in every respect the past was better than the present. Indeed, when liberals tell you that we must change our cherished institutions to make them more diverse, less bigoted, he is here to tell us that not only is this unneeded, but that, in fact, the true racists and bigots are the liberals, They are the ones bringing divisive race to these institutions. All we need to go is return back to their more perfect roots. It doesn't matter that this cherished past is largely a fiction. In fact, that might make it an even better story. And why should we all be worried by Calvin? Well, because Calvin Robinson is making headway. He has been retweeted by Jordan Peterson several times. He has appeared on Tucker Carlson's show and has been endorsed by Paul Golding, the leader of the far-right organisation Britain First. Here he is, hanging out with his friend at his ordination, Lawrence Fox, leader of the right-wing Reclaim Party. And here he is recently helping him out on the campaign trail. He has had on his show the leader of the far-right party UKIP, the former Trump advisor Sebastian Gorka, and several former MPs and MEPs, along with more establishment figures like the historian and veteran broadcaster David Sarkey, the head of the Free Speech Union Toby Young, and the former editor of the Sun newspaper Kelvin MacKenzie. He's also started to get invites to Parliament. Here he is, for example, taking a photo inside Parliament with the MP Jonathan Gullis, and here he is standing outside number 10. He's also become a regular speaker at right-wing events and on podcasts and radio shows on both sides of the Atlantic. Now maybe you think that all of this is small beer, but we must remember that he's only really been in the public eye for a little under 2 years. Already though, he is emerging as a prominent, perhaps the leading spokesman for a growing Christian nationalist movement in the UK. Now am I worried that they are going to take over anytime soon? No, probably not. But I don't think they need to take over the country to have a major impact. So watch out for Calvin Robinson and the rising tide of Christian nationalism in the UK, because I think they are coming for us.